Is there a stand I can use? There's a lot of stuff on it. You may recall a few months ago, back in October, one particular Sunday, I had a friend of mine who was passing through the area and visiting briefly, and he's a ministry friend, great big guy, if you remember me bringing him up front here. And it was one of my best friends in my teenage years and college years from my home church. He was the son of the pastor of the church, the pastor who had most discipled me and encouraged me as a young man to look beyond just music in the church to other types of ministry beyond that. And you may recall him being here. He's a pastor, has been a pastor. He's been a Bible conference director. He has his own discipleship ministry. He has a radio ministry. He's a writer. And I warned you before he came up here, and this is where you may remember it. I warned you before he came up here. I said, you're going to hear a radio voice here in just a second. And he, welcome, and he did one of these. And everybody just cracked up laughing. My friend, Dan Allen, again, one of my best friends in growing up. Again, as I said, his father was my pastor. As well, I was a second-year student at Dallas Seminary. My parents called me with some sad news to say that his father, our pastor, had driving on Route 22 in the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania area, having made a hospital visit, heading back to Phillipsburg, where we were from, and a truck driver who had mixed some drugs and alcohol and was in a construction zone and decided it would be a good time to pass in this just one lane each direction construction zone. And our pastor, he'd been a professional football player with the New York Giants. He'd met a lot of linebackers. He was a lineman, met a lot of linebackers in his day, but he was no match for a Mack truck, and he was killed instantly. That was 34 years ago. Why does God allow injustice and tragedies of this sort to happen? Why do we hear these stories of sadness in families like this? Where is God when these kinds of things happen? It's a timeless question. Well, my friend, this past Monday had a sort of similar experience happen. He was actually at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Tennessee. And he got a call that his 30-year-old son, who was a pastor himself in Las Cruces, New Mexico, was driving to the airport to pick up his brother. And apparently we don't know the story yet, but on an interstate going 90 miles an hour in the opposite direction toward him came a person who hit him head on. They were both killed instantly. So my friend has lost his father in a head-on collision. He's lost his son in a head-on collision. Both of them pastors, both of them folks being used by God in extensive ways. Why does God allow this sort of injustice? My friend Dan, I've talked with him some online and back and forth. He wrote one of the most amazing pieces of composition I've ever seen. He wrote it on his tablet, on the plane, flying from Tennessee down to New Mexico to be with his family. I'd love to read some of it to you, but I could never make it through. We all know these sorts of situations. Some of you have experienced this caliber of injustice that happens in your lives, and we see it around the world even. We see the prevalence of evil in the world. We see human rights violations happening in many corners of the earth, and in places like Cuba and China, for example. We see human trafficking that goes on in places like Thailand. We see the ethnic cleansing that has taken place in portions of sub-Saharan Africa, and the political and the military conflict that is broiling right now in the Ukraine as examples. Why does God allow these things? Why is there so much injustice in the world? Well, we continue today with our series called Uncharted Life in Perilous Times. We want to deal today with this question of evil. And last week we looked through the book of Lamentations a bit, and Chris did with you in his writings this last week, dealt with the issue of personal suffering. Today we focus more on suffering on a larger level, dealing with the question of evil and of ongoing injustice. And today we turn to the book of Habakkuk, not a place we go very often in the scriptures. But the prophet Habakkuk addresses these issues by affirming, yes, that there is the existence of evil, but yes, at the same time, affirming that God is sovereign over it all. And so when we go to Habakkuk, we go to a book where, well, we can put the chart up here as we have a few times and showing you the Old Testament prophets, and as we've been dealing with them in this series and sort of where they fit. We've been talking about the exile. You see at the bottom left, the pre-exilic prophets to Israel, the northern 10 tribes, Hosea and Amos. We've talked about them. The exile we're talking about is the Babylonian exile, and we're kind of approaching that now in a sort of a chronological way. And we look at Habakkuk, who wrote just before this time that the southern 2 tribes of Judah would be conquered by the Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar would be the name that you would associate with this. You would associate all the stories of Daniel with this as well. You see that Isaiah is something of a contemporary, a prophet as well to the southern 2 tribes of Judah during this time of history of God's people. And this little book here has 3 chapters. And it's really easy. It gave you a quick 4-chapter, one-word outline of Jonah last 2 weeks ago, about how Jonah made the sea sick, and he made the sailors sick, and he made God sick, and that outline. Well, here's a 3-word outline for you for the book of Habakkuk. First of all, he asks the question, why? He looks around, he sees, and he asks the kinds of questions that we've already asked this morning. Why? And then he gets an answer from God. And the answer from God is that God is a God of judgment, and he does have things squared away, and he keeps good score, and there is a woe upon those who disobey him. And then the final chapter is a prayer, a prayer of reverence, of awe, as the prophet yields himself again to God and God's plan. Well, let's jump into the book of Habakkuk from the beginning. We're going to look through all of chapter 1, and we're going to pick just a few verses out of chapters 2 and 3. From the very top, it begins like this. Chapter 1, verse 1 of Habakkuk, the prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. And we're going to see that he has a complaint here that the prophet makes before the Lord. He says this, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted." We look at this, we read these words, and we see Habakkuk, and we see that this is one of these folks in the Old Testament prophets, and we said it would be like this, and this is kind of why we chose this series. I mean, here's a guy, you'd almost look at him and say, wow, is he living today? Is he looking around the world today and making his remarks based upon what he sees, even in our age? But Habakkuk, what he's doing is kind of coming before God as a prophet and saying, hey, God, where are you right now? Are you looking around? You got me doing this prophet gig thing, and I'm supposed to be calling out about righteousness to the people, and I'm trying to do this thing here. And you know what? There's all this injustice around here. Do you see this? Have you seen what's going on around here? How long do I keep crying out to you? How long? Where are you? Why aren't you stepping in? Why aren't you intervening? Why are you not slapping down these folk who are doing the wrong stuff and exalting righteousness? where are you? You seem to be gone. The law is paralyzed. Justice never prevails. He was having a tough time as a prophet. Injustice seemed to prevail everywhere. And this was after the reign of King Josiah. Remember King Josiah, and they found the book of the law, and there was sort of a revival in Judah, and some good things happened. But right after that, the people went back into a sinful condition. There were a number of different vassal kings, and by that we mean where a stronger power kind of came in instead of beating you up real bad. What we're going to do here is we're going to let you be a king, but you're going to be our JV king here thing, okay? You can still be king, but you need to be a good boy, and you need to do things the way we would like you to do things here. And if you don't, we're going to come in and we're going to roll your head, okay? That's what's going to happen. So that happened under the Egyptians, and then later it would happen under the Babylonians. So it was a time of all sorts of political intrigue and injustice, and all sorts of things were happening. And he speaks of the situation as being hemmed in. Isn't that interesting that in the scriptures you see this word? We use that phrase, we just feel like I'm just really hemmed in, Here they were using that phrase, like 2,700 years ago. But it seems weakly in our culture today, as people who care about traditional values and righteousness, that we look around. And it seems that we see where these values are being overturned at every corner. And we have a sense of being overwhelmed. We have a sense of being outnumbered, of increasingly despairing, and feeling that our viewpoints are not only not accepted, they're being rejected and despised, and us along with it. Where's the justice? Well, the Lord gives an answer. Go to verse 5. We'll read from 5 to 11 here. It says, "Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed." This is the Lord speaking now, and Habakkuk is penning it. "For I am going to do something in your days that you will not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. And then they sweep past like the wind and go on, guilty people whose own strength is their God." And God's using them. God says that he's doing something that Habakkuk and others would not believe. He's answering this issue of injustice that's going on in Judah. Yeah, he's answering it. You know how he's answering it? He's answering it by bringing judgment through these people, the new bad boys on the block, the Babylonians. Yeah, these people who are so bad that it says of them that they are a law onto themselves. Now, this is not what you expect to hear God saying. Now, is it? That he's going to prosper the newest and worst bullies on the planet, the evil powerhouse guys, the world empire at the time. And you would expect him to protect Judah as his own people, even as he had done innumerable times in their history, protected them from these powerful entities around them. Their strength is described, that is the Babylonian strength, described in verses 8 and 9, their military strength as having speed and destruction, the picture of kind of the speed of a leopard and the destructive and tearing and ripping qualities of a wolf at dusk. There's a picture as well of an eagle. The word that's used here is a bird that's common in the Mideast that sort of soars in the heights, sees its prey, and then suddenly swoops down and captures it. That's what these folk were like. They could come, and says, as a desert wind. This is the same word we saw 2 weeks ago in Jonah in chapter 4 about the east wind that dried up everything. Literally, the word is a sirocco. It's a sort of like, what can you do to escape this giant windstorm that's coming? It's kind of, what can we do to escape the polar vortex? I mean, hey, you look at the maps and you see this big front coming. What can you do? How can you stand it? It's going to just come and it's going to move on behind. It's going to overwhelm. That's the way these people were. They mocked at kings, and these guys were especially good at this quality, of taking kings from conquered lands and taking back to Babylon and doing unspeakable things to them. What they did, in fact, to one of Judah's vassal kings when he wasn't a good boy and didn't do what they wanted him to do, what they did is they got his sons, they killed his sons in front of him, and then they poked his eyes out. So that would be the last thing that he would see. And remember, these are the kinds of guys and folk that God is saying, I'm doing something unbelievable. I'm going to use these people to judge Judah. What? How can this be? And so Habakkuk, beginning now in verse 12, has a second kind of complaint that he gives to the Lord. And he starts at, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. But your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his nets. He gathers them in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? Is that to continue? So here, again, to give you kind of a New Jersey way of looking at this, he comes before the Lord. And he says, that first verse is a good one. It starts out pretty good. Oh Lord, you have decreed, and you are God, and yes, and I know your righteousness. I know your character, but hey, how can you do this? What are you doing here? Look, we're bad. Yeah, I admit we're bad. Remember, that's what I said earlier. Why aren't you doing something about it? I admit you're bad, but hey, these guys are worse. How can you possibly be doing this? You're too holy to kind of look the other way. You're going to use the worse to punish the more righteous. I know it's kind of relative and everything, God, but really? That's what you're doing here? Well, the illustration that he uses is kind of, like guys going for fish. The fish don't have a leader. They don't have like a kingfish. There is a kingfish, isn't there? But there's not like, I'm saying, the kingfish and a school of fish or whatever. They're not organized. They don't have like, primary elections and general elections and things like that. And they're just kind of randomly captured and thrown aside to be devoured. And that's the way people were with the Babylonians. They came in, they took them, they rejoiced, they feasted on it. And again, how can God look upon this? And they worship, he says, and so what they do is they worship their nets, like fishermen, they worship their nets. It's like, what's he saying? What do the Babylonians do? They're godless people, is what he's saying. They're godless people, Lord. They worship their power. That's their God. Their God is their power and their ability to exploit and to bring injustice upon other peoples around the world. How can you be using them? And so, look on here. Verse 1 of chapter 2. And really, it should really go with chapter 1. But here it says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. We will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to his complaint. Now, this verse doesn't sound very good at first reading, now does it? It almost seems like he's saying, I'm going to stand here and I'm going to wait for you to answer my question. I can't believe, I don't know how you're going to answer this. I can't believe I'm going to stand here, and the idea of standing on the ramparts, it's like standing on the walls, like imagine the city walls, imagine the watchman who stands on the walls and looks. He said, I'm going to stand here, God. I'm going to wait for you to answer my question about what is it that you are doing. Why? And that's our verse. That's our word for chapter 1. Why? Why, God, are you doing this? Why do you allow injustice? And then why do you use the more wicked to judge the less wicked? I need an answer to this. And that's what it seems like at first glance. But honestly, if you put it together back with the beginning of his complaint where he said, Lord, I know who you are. I trust in you. I rest in you. I go to your character. I acknowledge your character. I don't understand all this. This seems completely wrong. What are you doing? And then it's kind of, I'm really anxious. I want to see what your answer is going to be to this. And then that's what chapter 2 is all about. it's the answer that he gives. Now, chapter 2 is kind of complicated. It's very pictorial. I'd encourage you to check in on our online devotionals this week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I'll be writing about this, and we'll have sort of a verse-by-verse way of going through this. And Thursday and Friday, we anticipate next Sunday when Tim comes and speaks on Daniel and Daniel writings the week after that. But check in with that for more detail on this. But suffice it to say here that chapter 2 is God giving his perspective on it. It's a bit complicated. Go down to verse 12. We'll kind of give a summary here. God says, "Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice." The person who does bloodshed and injustice, woe to them. God's basically saying, I'm keeping score here. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is but fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? God is saying here throughout all of chapter 2 that there is indeed a day of justice coming for all people, that God does keep the books well, that those who ignore him and deal in wrongdealing will be judged, be they his covenant people or be they the peoples of the world, that their evil doing is basically, he's saying here, fuel for his fires of judgment. There is a bigger picture, and here it is in verse 14, one of the great scriptures in the Bible. It says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." That's the day that is coming. That is what God is working toward. That is what he is marching toward. A day of universal judgment where his glories will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. This is a repeat of a promise that came from one of his own contemporaries, from Isaiah, just before his time, who had written in Isaiah in chapter 1 about Christ. This is a prophetic reference to Jesus and the work of the cross and of Christ. It says in Isaiah 11, let me just read a couple quick hits from there. It says, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch will bear fruit." And of course, that is Christ. "Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. And then a day will come," it says, "the wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the goat." And reading on further, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And in that day the root of Jesse," Jesus, "will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious." Now, God is going to make that happen. Now, God was going to judge Israel near term. After that, he was going to judge the Babylonians. After that, other world empires would come. They would rise. They would fall. Christ would come. Christ would take the debt of sin and pay it for all time. Christ would offer a kingdom to those who believe. We believe that kingdom will be fulfilled on earth in a period of 1,000 years. We call the millennium. That is yet to come. And ultimate righteousness, of course, finally prevails in a new kingdom and a new earth of the eternal state. All of that is promised and yet to come. And these Old Testament prophets look for these things, and all of those things are kind of a jumble of what is anticipated in the future. But the gravity and the immensity of this revelation, then, as we turn to chapter 3, leads the prophet to a time of prayer, of worship. It says, chapter 3, verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, on Shigionoth. That's a musical term or an instrument or something like that. So it is like a musical prayer that he has here. "Lord, I have heard your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Lord, repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy." The prophet here, Habakkuk, worships God. He finds awe in God's sovereign plans. He prays for his own day in his own time. And in that prayer, he seeks and speaks of God's mercy, which can be found always in any troubled day in sufficient quantities for those who trust him. Skipping down now to the final verses of Habakkuk, end of chapter 3, of his wow prayer and the end of his prophetic word. "Though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights." This is the view that he ends with, is a view that we need to always get to. The view that no matter what happens, even the worst of things, if Nothing of prosperity is to be found about us. That inner peace is not dependent upon this prosperity and outward circumstances, but upon the inner relationship of who we are with our God. And for us, it is who we are with God through Christ Jesus, our Lord. The deer picture that's here is one that speaks of strength and of dexterity, of sure-footedness, of beauty, and of speed. And, you think of the deer out in the woods and how the deer is able in the dark and in the thickets to quickly navigate through it with dexterity. You think of the deer as they're on sheer cliffs and mountain ranges, the sure-footedness of it all, and the dexterity that they have in it all. It says that as we trust in God, even in times of difficulty, even when life is perilous, the subtitle of our Uncharted series, that God makes us like that we have a sufficient resource in Him. And it's a principle of life that I have noted, especially seeing some of our folk here with ALS, other friends and Christian friends. It just seems so many. I've heard so much of this just recently of the ALS. Just thinking of them in particular and others. We have a couple other folk here who are walking through very difficult times in which the medical field shakes their heads with little in the way of answers. And yet you see God's strength in the midst of these times for them, that raise them up into such a way that we look at them and our sadness for them. We cannot understand how they have such joy and they have such strength in the midst of the struggle that they are going through, because God has said that His grace would always be sufficient for us in these times. So how do we connect with this idea together? How do we connect with this idea in our time? How in this era of the church and the era of the gospel, how do we connect? And how do we function in a world that is filled with evil and seems to prosper? And we do so as Habakkuk did. We step back to have a broader picture of God's work, and we cling to who God is. That's what he did when he didn't know what to think and didn't understand it. He went back and rehearsed what did he know about God and God's character, because God and His truth are going to prevail. And though we may not experience every aspect of it in our day, we may know His grace and faithfulness in sufficient quantity that we are able to endure successfully in whatever circumstances prevail around us. And the biggest idea of it all is that we have as His promise an eternal reward, an eternal relationship that begins imperfectly now, but has its perfect fulfillment in our time with Him, in an eternal kingdom of a new heaven and a new home and a new earth that He has made for us. Throughout the New Testament, we see this idea of Christ as the victor. So many passages in the New Testament reference this. Jesus Himself had told His disciples, He said, I tell you these things that you may have peace. In this world you'll have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. In 1 Corinthians 15, it talks there about the perishable, putting on the imperishable and asking, where is your victory, death? Where is your sting? And he says, the sting of death is sin, but the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, He gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Paul to the Colossians said, he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in Christ. The Christian life is therefore about affirming these kinds of truths, knowing that while evil still exists, there will be a day when it is finally snuffed out by Christ's return, when He sets all things right again. I need to quickly move on and move along here, but there is an illustration of a Christian writer who talked about how he got interested in that series 24, with is it Jack Bauer is his name, and how he always seems to get in these terrible circumstances but finds a way out. He said, I really got fixated on this, and one night, he said, I would stay up late at night, and he said, and this one night, Jack died. And I'm thinking, should I stay awake for what's coming next, because I need to go to bed, but should I don't know, should I go on? And he's kind of getting caught up at these sort of like looking videos at previous series, and he had the next one, should he go and should he look at it or not, and then he said, as he was contemplating it, the credits went by and he saw that Jack Bauer was played by Kiefer Sutherland. Kiefer Sutherland was not only the actor, he was the executive producer of the show. He said, I turned it off and went straight to sleep. Once I saw that as long as the executive producer of the story is its main character, the character will always come out on top, even through death. And in the final chapter of God's masterpiece called Time, we don't need to stay up at night wondering how it's going to come out. The good news is that our executive producer has secured our victory. He's the main character of history, and according to the script, one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is the Lord, and this is indeed the truth. Atheism argues that God exists, or that evil exists, and if God exists, then he would intervene. And since nobody's intervened, therefore God cannot exist. The agnostic argues, evil exists. Secondly, the supposed God of love should intervene. It doesn't seem like the God of love is intervening. Therefore, there is no God of love who can be trusted, so depend upon yourself. And of course, the essence of Christianity is to disagree with point 3 of both of those statements and to say that God has intervened. He intervened 2,000 years ago on a cross when he took our sins, and he made promises, and he said to his disciples that he would go and prepare a place for them and come back and receive them to himself to be ever with him. That time simply has not come when all of that is realized, but it does not evade the reality that Christ has indeed intervened, that God is real, and God has a plan over it all. I'll finish with this story of a schoolmaster and his children. In a one-room schoolhouse, the schoolmaster had put the schoolhouse together, made this wonderful playground for the children. But he told the children, when you go out to the playground, you can't all play on the same implement at the same time, or you'll break it. Well, over time, what happened? They all thought something was fun. They all got fighting over it, and they got playing on it, and they broke it. Then they broke the next thing, and next thing you know, the whole playground is broken. And the schoolmaster sees this, and he says to the children, I'm willing to forgive you, and I'm desirous of forgiving this. And what I am going to do is I will make a way, and I will forgive you. I'm going to make for you a new schoolhouse with a marvelous new playground. And some time went by, and they continued in the same playground, the same schoolhouse. Some began to doubt, but he showed them the receipts. He showed them how he had paid for all of this and was putting it together. He indeed had paid for it. And time went by, and new children came to the school. New children began to even doubt there's a possibility the sky even exists, that his promises are worth anything. The whole thing just seemed to be kind of pie in the sky, and by. And so some of them walked away from believing that anything would ever happen. Many failed to believe. And though there were fun times still in the old school and the playground, many of the children became angry at the schoolmaster for delaying and not providing a perfect playground at the old location, since the new location seemed little more than a fantasy. Doesn't that story make you want to get those children and grab a hold of them and just slap them all for their insolence? But you know what? We're the children. We're the children in the application of the story. We don't deserve anything because of sin, but God has paid the price in full. He's gone to prepare a place for us. And though it's not yet been realized, and though we still play in the old playground and the broken equipment, and sometimes there's a lot of fun even playing with the broken equipment, and sometimes there's joy, but often there's a lot of frustration with it. It does not mean, though, that God is not faithful and that a final day of justice will not prevail. And we have it in his word that it will, and that is what we trust in.